per $1,000, the actual taxes, and a comparator with our neighboring municipalities, the residential property taxes per 1,000 and our neighboring municipalities, and commercial taxes. So we generally see these reports where they come in and they say, well, it's based on $407,000 market value. I just cleaner if it's just per $1,000.
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, maybe we can work with the councillor and share with the councillor the BMA tax competitiveness study, because that is a study that I believe somewhere in the area, 82 municipalities, we all report jointly through that, and there's a number of comparators as it relates to tax performance, multi-residential, residential, commercial, industrial, and see if that meets the councillor's requirement, and we'll share that with all committee. If not, we can endeavor to provide what the additional information.
If the work's already done by someone else, just reference it to me and I'd be very happy. Thank you very much.
Councillor Merla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of things. I think it's important that we recognize when we're dealing with comparisons, we have to compare apple to apple. In that Hamilton, as you know, is an incredibly old city, one of the oldest in the country. And when we look at some of our neighboring communities, through you, Mr. Chairman, it would be unfair to compare some of the challenges that we're faced with that they aren't faced with. But over and above that, from a social perspective, as you know, Mr. Chairman, is that we do have poverty issues. So can you just elaborate on some of the unique challenges that we as a municipality have that, for instance, municipalities in Peel would not even be facing remotely?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, for those of us who've been in the municipal sector for some time, as we've seen those experiences across the various sectors, some councillors may recall the days of social pooling within the GTA municipality, where those municipalities outside of the City of Toronto within the GTA were providing tax base to the City of Toronto to assist the City of Toronto with respect to their social services related costs. When the previous government phased out pooling, that in effect reduced the tax burden for those GTA municipalities other than the City of Toronto. Now, some of those municipalities used that tax room to invest in social services. Some made investments into social housing. But again, looking at our comparator groups, the overall basket of services and the impacts of those services varies across municipalities. So again, in the city of Hamilton, we see that we have some higher than average costs in some of those services versus other municipalities, recognizing that some of those municipalities are increasing their investment. So within the GTA, some of those municipalities are starting to make some of those investments in housing that other jurisdictions have been making for some time. As well, beyond just the social services related costs, you'll recall me reporting back in previous years that City of Hamilton, not only have we maintained services and service levels, we've enhanced services. That's not the case for some municipalities. Windsor was the one that's drawn some focus in the past. Because of their financial situation, they've had to reduce some of their services. And it's a function of their financial means, and they've reduced their daycare services as well as some of their other services. So again, we're all in different positions or situations. While we provide typically the same services, we provide them at different levels. And so again, that is some of the contributing factors. I'll point out as well as we all don't have the same tools. City of Toronto has some unique tools. You might have read recently is they've grown very reliant on the land transfer tax. That land transfer tax, I believe in 2018 represented somewhere about 15 to 18% of their total tax revenue. And so because of changes in mortgage rules, they're seeing some pressure as it relates to the land transfer tax. So not only are we somewhat different from our comparator groups as it relates to the services, but in the case of City of Toronto, they have some unique tools that City of Hamilton doesn't have as well.
So on that issue of comparatives, I think it's important to you, Mr. Chairman, that all of that be incorporated in coming to some sort of understanding of what we're faced with, what we have been faced with, in order to give an actual real picture, as opposed to just simply looking at the bottom line numbers, which really does not in any way, it simplifies the issue entirely without looking into the complexities of all those variables that contribute to the fact that when you look at what we've been able to accomplish in maintaining services and enhancing it, but yet still be competitive, is quite remarkable and something that we need to not only highlight, but have people understand, because obviously I think on paper, again, from a simplistic standpoint, it sounds great that we have this huge assessment growth in residential. But the reality, though, is that when you compare that to commercial and industrial assessment growth, the return on investment of commercial residential is actually in a surplus scenario for the general coffers, as opposed to a deficit scenario in residential, in that we have to provide additional services in those residential areas. So can you just elaborate on that issue? Because that's an important factor that, again, is misunderstood and needs to be understood.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll just suggest there's two considerations as it relates to how the various classes have a financial impact. Is the councillor is correct, is that all assessment is not equal. Residential, again, is you'll see these references, the assessment references represent unweighted assessment. So again, that is not applying the tax ratios to those numbers. And given that residential has a tax ratio of 1 and commercial 2.55, and industrial is, our large industrial or standard industrial is in excess of 3, is for each dollar of unweighted assessment, the non-residential pays more in property goods. Their workers consume those goods, but the actual commercial or industrial entity directly does not consume those goods. So again, two impacts. Higher tax ratios represent a greater overall tax benefit, and the fact that those direct entities don't consume the goods that are residential and their workers consume provides some positive impact as well.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, again, with respect to the ratio of residential versus commercial industrial, my understanding is that 87% is residential and 13% is commercial and industrial as it pertains to our revenue. Is that correct?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, as it pertains to our unweighted assessment, and that has been a priority for a number of councils now to try to shift that ratio and to grow our non-residential base, and that's part of our economic development strategy as well. But I will point out, if you look at that figure as a percentage of the overall, it is still probably somewhere in the area of about 78%, 77%, if I do my math quickly, which would suggest we're not moving that yardstick. We are still reliant on residential. And so while that is a target, we're not, again, moving that yardstick in the direction we want to move that yardstick.
And now, in my closing comment, I think it's important to emphasize that when you're looking at areas such as wards 3 and 4, where they have a larger percentage of industrial commercial tax base than anywhere else in the city, and in some cases it's almost 50%, that those monies, because of the revenue, far outweighs the actual costs of providing services, that in many ways that is a subsidy for the remainder of the city in contributing to areas that have highly residential areas. So through you, Mr. Chairman, can you just elaborate on that aspect?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, yes. So in terms of the mix, across all the wards, there's a mix of assessment base across all the classes. Each ward will have some residential, commercial, industrial, institutional. There's different concentrations across the various wards. So again, if we look at the traditional industrial area, there is still a significant reliance on non-residential. I'll suggest that is growing in other parts of the ward, and in some of the wards, institutional represents a significant component of their ward makeup.
Now, institutional, though, through you, Mr. Chairman, there's no revenue attached to it. So in that sense, that's the worst case example.
You, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll suggest there's limited revenue. So this has been a long-standing issue with municipalities in the province of Ontario. There's the The form of taxation that our institutional partners pay is referred to as heads and beds. It represents $75 per full-time student and per hospital bed. That $75 was set in 1987 and hasn't been adjusted since 1987. Municipalities have put forward this, our previous councils, City of Hamilton councils, have put forward a number of resolutions with a number of options to move that industrial tax base to something in the commercial residential range. We also put forward, previous councils put forward resolutions asking that the $75 be indexed simply for inflation. It has not been a conversation that the provinces wanted to have at the staff level. And so, again, we haven't put a lot of concerted effort into that issue, given the reaction we're receiving at the staff level.
And I think through you, Mr. Chairman, we've had that same reaction politically as well. As you know, we had the summit regarding the downloading and received no traction whatsoever from the province. So through you, Mr. Chairman, that brings me to the downloading question. And that out of our entire operating budget, what does our operating budget, what does that mean for our operating budget, so on a percentage basis?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll ask Brian if he has the latest numbers. How we've presented the provincially shared programs in the past, we've communicated it to our residents as it relates to their impact, an average property tax bill. And I believe it was somewhere in the area of 40% or just below 40% of the average residential property tax bill represents provincially shared programs.
Okay, and through you, Mr. Chairman, that in essence means we have absolutely no control of those programs. We're mandated to provide them, and we have no control over the impact.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that is correct.
Okay, so through you, Mr. Chairman, do you know of any other jurisdiction in the entire Western Democratic Hemisphere that actually has social assistance and housing on the backs of the general levy?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, with respect to housing specifically, we are the only jurisdiction in Ontario where municipalities, through what I'll describe as a regressive form of taxation, which is property tax, which is the only tool that we really have, that we rely upon, that it's only this jurisdiction that relies on property tax in part to pay for social housing.
So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, our biggest challenge and when it comes to our operating budget and maintaining our existing services, and looking at the biggest chunk of what we don't have control over, would it be a fair statement to say that downloading represents the most significant challenge we face in controlling our costs?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, absolutely. All municipalities